Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm so pleased you can join us today for our presentation. I'm George Blumenthal. I'm the director of the Center for Studies in Higher Education at UC Berkeley, and we are sponsoring this presentation on current trends in the future of higher education admissions policies. So I'm very much looking forward to our two presenters today. And to introduce them, I'd like to introduce you to Margaret Heisel, who's one of the scholars who resides at the Center for Studies in Higher Education. So Margaret.
Thank you, George. And hello, everyone. And welcome to today's webinar discussion regarding some of the trends and challenges that higher education foresees over the next few years. As George said, my name is Margaret Heisel, and I'm a senior research associate here. Now, returning to the challenges, one of the most serious challenges that's facing higher education in the next few years is declining enrollment because of the declining number of high school graduates. And today, that's the issue we're focusing on, along with rising costs of higher education and rising amounts of student debt, emerging alternatives to college, possible curriculum changes that have to do with students' concerns about their careers. And also there is, I'm sure you would concede, greater interest in online higher education and how that's going to develop along with these enrollment declines. Now, we're already in something of a decline. About 4% of enrollment declined from spring 21 to spring 22. That included both graduate students and undergraduates. Also, spring 21 already represented a drop of 3.5% from the previous year. And in this enrollment, male students were falling quite substantially. These recent years, of course, were very much influenced by the pandemic, but the population of prospective high school graduates will decrease by about 15% by 2025. These decreases will be very heavily focused on the Northeast and the Midwest of the United States, while numbers of potential students in the South and the West, however, are actually expected to increase. But that could mean that there could be quite a bit of competition and recruitment in those years. As total number of high school graduates drop, the proportion of students from ethnic minority and first-generation backgrounds are going to rise. Other issues growing in influence will include tuition and student loans, standardized testing differences, competition between small and larger institutions, higher education budget factors for sure as institutions look for economies, and shifts in international student enrollment. One very serious question is how interaction among all of these changes will impact future admissions policies and how recruitment will have to change. To explore and speak authoritatively about these issues, we have two very distinguished speakers discussing these trends. First will be Nathan Grawe, who is professor of economics at Carleton College. He's also the author of Demographics and the Demand for Higher Education, and another book called The Agile College. Second, we will hear from Jeff Selingo, who is professor of practice at Arizona State University and a journalist who has written very extensively on higher education. His latest book is very significant for this discussion. It's called Who Gets In and Why? A Year Inside College Admissions. Earlier, he published a book called College Unbound and one called The Future of Higher Education and What It Means for Students. There's Life After College. These two authors will present to us on recruitment and admissions to be expected in upcoming years and how admissions policies may have to change. After our two speakers have completed their presentations, they will respond to the questions many of you have raised as you registered for this webinar. And all of you today may submit questions during the webinar on the chat function on your screen. So we look forward to hearing from you. And now we turn to our first speaker. Nathan, please, would you begin your presentation? Thank you.
Nathan, you're muted.
Thank you so much for having me, Margaret. It's a pleasure to be with you all. It might seem in recent years that higher education has begun to resemble that famous fortune cookie that says, may you live in interesting times. We have a lot of change going on. It does make things challenging, especially in the admissions side of higher education. But as we'll see, the challenges that we face on the admissions side have implications for the entire campus. Some of the trends are relatively slow moving. So for instance, we can look at what is going on in the country in terms of racial distribution and the composition of young people. This work that you see presented here, this chart comes from William Frey of the Brookings Institution. Here he's estimating the tipping point year, that is when the population becomes a minority non-Hispanic white. For the country as a whole, it happens around mid-century, 2045. But when we look at the population of younger individuals, we see a more diverse population. And so for those under age 18, Frey estimates we've already passed the tipping point. So for those of us in traditional age higher ed, we have been seeing and can expect to continue to see a shift in this composition toward groups that have frankly not been in the traditional pools of higher education. So that presents a challenge. We're also seeing at the same time changes by geography due to migration, differences in birth rates, the disembarkation points for immigrants, tending to move the country away from the West Coast and out of the far Northeast toward the South and the Southwest more generally. And that too presents challenges for higher education, especially when we think about private higher education, for instance, that is focused in the Northeast. There are a lot of institutions in that Northeast sector, and we're seeing a declining number of students as the population shifts. Now, not all of the trends that we're facing are negative for higher education. For instance, we can look at educational attainment. This is really important because those who have college degrees are much more likely to send their children to college, and in particular, to send their children to more selective forms of higher education. So here we can see the share of those ages 25 to 29 with various degrees. I think it's really remarkable to see that when I was looking at colleges roughly around 1990, we were only at about 23% of the population of 25 to 29-year-olds who had a bachelor's degree, whereas in 2020, that number had increased substantially to 39%. So as we look forward, we can anticipate a more educated parent population, and that does provide some interesting additional nuance to the data. So as we'll see in a second, we're seeing a decline in the number of young people, but if we're increasing the share of young people who come from families where we have higher education backgrounds, we might anticipate that institutions like Berkeley and other flagship institutions might actually have a growing market, despite the fact that the market for higher education in general is declining. Now, one of the more fast-moving trends in terms of demographics that we've seen recently has been a change in fertility. Starting around 2008, with the onset of the financial crisis, we've seen a reduction in fertility rates. In part, this is due to a delay in marriages, in part it's due to a delay in births, and in part it's due to a reduction in the number of babies being born per family. But when we put it all together, the number of babies that we see born per year in the CDC data looks something like this. So as you see here, from 1975 to roughly that 2008 financial crisis, we were in a time of secular increase. There were decades when there were more and more young people to recruit. In fact, this was really the tail end of a golden era in higher education. If you go back to World War II, and then forward just a few years, so you're in the early 1950s, you could look back 5 years before and you would note that there were more enrollments than there had been in 1952, just 5 years before. So in the past 5 years, we've seen growth. And in fact, in every year from 1952 until 2014, that's what you would have seen. You would have seen we're in an era of growth. The last 5 years have produced more enrollments in higher education than 5 years before. But since 2014, we have not been able to say that in any year. And so we're in a new period. If we look at the number of babies born in 2020, we're seeing a number that we hadn't seen in 40 years. The decline is over 15%. If we think about when this would hit higher education, 2008 plus 18 years means in the mid-2020s, we start to experience this contraction. And it now, we can anticipate, extends through most of, if not all, of the 2030s. So we have a significant change in demographics. We're shifting in composition in ways that aren't entirely comfortable for higher education at the same time that we're anticipating a contraction in the number of students. As Margaret pointed out, there is a geographical component of this. The Northeast and the Great Lakes regions have been particularly strong participants in low fertility. They were early adopters, if you will. However, if you look across the United States today, no state has got a fertility rate, a total fertility rate that exceeds what sociologists term the replacement rate. That is the rate necessary to replace the population with fecundity alone. And so we are in a period in higher education when we're looking forward to at least stasis and maybe increasing scarcity. And some of our policies maybe were developed in a different time period and when we had expanding numbers of young people, and that presents some challenges. If we look within higher education itself, we also see, I think, some trends that are worth contemplating as we think about demographic forces that we face. So first, if we're going to see a weakening in the domestic market for higher ed, many institutions think perhaps it makes sense to look abroad. And I do think some institutions will find relief abroad, but we should temper that with some caution. So this graph comes from the Institute of International Education, which reports the number here of new international student enrollments. The yellow line shows the undergraduate enrollments. Ignore for now what happened during COVID there. You see that large decline. We've seen a recovery, but it's been incomplete. But you'll notice even before COVID, we were on a downward trend. And if you look at the start of that trend, it doesn't start with the Trump administration. The first downward year is into the 2016-17 year, when matriculation decisions were made under the assumption, I think among many, that we were going to have a Clinton presidency to follow an Obama presidency. I think that's a good reminder that some of the forces that we face in the international student market are indeed driven by visa policies and so on, but many of the forces that make it harder to recruit internationally have to do with increased competition from the United Kingdom, from Canada, from Australia, from India and China themselves, who are creating institutions modeled on our own. So the international student market has been a real winner for higher education in the United States. We've seen more growth since World War II in international student enrollment than domestic, which is really saying something. And yet we have softness in that market as well. If we look at matriculation rates among domestic high school graduates, I think we also have some reason for concern. So here we're seeing it broken down by race and ethnicity. You can see in the heavy black line the national average. And if you look from the early 1980s through roughly the Great Recession, I think it's notable that we were seeing a convergence. In particular, we saw rising rates, matriculation rates among Hispanic and African-American young people, so that we were very, very near the national average during this time period. And then the Great Recession happened, and you can see since then, the matriculation rates in general have been trending downward. And in particular, we see downward trends in the African-American and the Hispanic population. So if we're anticipating a time period in the future where we have fewer students in general graduating high school, our pools are shrinking, we might think that we are going to get around that by increasing matriculation rates. But recent matriculation data suggests that we have some real work to do, both closing gaps, but also just addressing broader issues that seem to be leading to a declining matriculation rate. In addition, as Margaret suggested, we've seen some changes that are noteworthy in the long run when it comes to matriculation rates by sex. So here we have those same matriculation rates among high school graduates for women and men. I think it's important to note that when we see the sex gap opening up in higher ed, it's a lot of the story is simply that the men have not increased as much as the women have. So there's stasis. But on the other hand, if we look at the last 10 years or so, we can see the declining matriculation rates in both subgroups that, again, give us pause when we think about recruiting our way out of shrinking pools. When we think about higher education and our ability to recruit, I think it's important to think about how students view that process. They definitely view the matriculation decision as an investment in their lives. They're very concerned about what happens after. And I think there are some now long-standing trends in higher education that give us pause on that front as well. So this is data from the Digest of Education Statistics on student success. We're looking 6 years after the start of post-secondary enrollment. In the left-hand column, starting at a 2-year institution, at the right hand at a 4-year institution. At a 2-year institution, I think it's interesting to note that if you enroll at a 2-year institution, 6 years later, you're more likely to have no degree and not even be enrolled in school than to have any degree at all. I think that's a troubling statistic. Obviously, many students enroll in 2-year institutions. Surveys suggest up to 80% thinking they're going to get a bachelor's degree. 6 years later, about 1 in 10 will actually achieve that goal. If we look at 4-year institutions, I think it's tempting to conclude that we're doing a better job for those of us in the 4-year sector. After all, 67% 6 years later will have some degree, and I suppose that is better than 42%. But I have to say, as a member of the 4-year college community, this number is just far too low. 1 in 5 students will not have any degree, and they will not be enrolled anywhere. So when I think about a young person thinking about enrolling, it's awfully hard to tell them, look, you've got like a 1 in 5 chance that you'll end up with nothing versus a 3 in 5 chance that you'll get the degree that you set out to accomplish. Along the way, you can be promised that you'll walk away with the debt in many cases. These are not exactly the kinds of marketing messages that I think serve us well. So there are some trends within higher education, in addition to these broader societal trends, that make the present moment challenging. But I don't want to suggest that everything is doom and gloom. I think higher education has a lot of agency, and we should embrace that. I think the last 2 years have shown higher education to be capable of tremendous change. The question is whether we will embrace the facts as they are. I think there's an argument that during COVID, everyone very quickly recognized that we could not continue with the status quo. And it allowed us to do some really, really impressive work to continue moving forward, if albeit in some restricted ways, despite some real challenges. So how do I see, what are some trends that I see in institutional responses to these challenges? First, I see some creative work in access. This example comes from Boston College. I don't put it up because I think everyone should follow in this path, but rather because I think it exemplifies an attitude, in particular an attitude to reconsider one's own self-identity as an institution when thinking about the access agenda. That is to say, meeting students at least halfway when thinking about the gaps between students who may not be engaged in higher education and the institutions who want to enroll them. So here, Boston College, Drake University in Iowa is another example of this, have created associate degree programs within their traditional 4-year colleges, fundamentally questioning, what does it mean to be Boston College? I think it's really laudable. The institution, faculty, and staff are willing to reconsider something so fundamental. Do we offer 2-year degrees, having recognized that there are students who are a good fit for Boston College, but are not a good fit for Boston College if it retains its identity as solely a 4-year granting institution. We're seeing a lot more talk about student success, not that that hasn't happened in the past. A lot of this is simply following through on the research that is really, really deep in higher education. We know that the reason students walk away is often due to one of 3 factors: social sense of belonging, finances, and then academic preparation. And we know a lot of what works in terms of addressing those things. So for instance, in the upper left-hand corner, this is St. Cloud State University in my home state. They're doing a brief survey the 3rd week students are on campus to identify students who have low sense of social belonging, so they can get that information into relevant faculty and staff hands to draw those students into the community. At the University of Southern Maine, they've dramatically revamped their advising program, recognizing that while technology can provide some solutions, ultimately a lot of the work in retention has to be very personal and requires a personal touch. In 2014, I believe it was, they were in the midst of a lot of budget cutting because they didn't have sufficient enrollments. By increasing their retention rates by something like 8 percentage points, they've actually generated a surplus despite having declining numbers of students walking in the front door. Some of the things that we talk about in terms of retention work can be repackaging existing programs with new systems. So the Equitas program in urban leadership I point to here at Wheaton College is an example of a cohort-based program. We know cohort-based programs draw students into a smaller community that they can connect to, and as a result, serve to support student success and retention. Other institutions are focusing on the connection to life outside of college. So Strata here points out that in the context of two-year institutions in particular, 70% of those who had an associate degree and a non-degree credential said that their education made them an attractive job candidate, compared to just 43% of those who didn't have that non-degree credential. And I think here we see the competition that education is increasingly facing from outside of higher ed, which is institutions like Google or Amazon can offer these kinds of credentials. And we need to think as institutions, what is it that our students need and want so that they can go back into the world beyond our walls and succeed. At Dunwoody, this looks like restructuring programs to help with that credentialing process. They were looking at some of their curricula and realizing that some of the machine technician credentialing was coming sort of late in the process. You had to do several classes until you got the credential. And by rearranging their curriculum, they could move the credential up so that you earned that credential after one term at Dunwoody. And then that same introductory class opened into 3 degree granting programs. Now, of course, Dunwoody preferred that the students would stay on and complete those degrees, but they understood that the primary interest of those adult students was to get the credential and get back to work. And many of those students have continued to work, if slowly, toward those associate degrees. But the institution was willing to recognize what it was that the student was looking for in that early credential. In the New Hampshire system, it looked like working system-wide. No one institution within the system had the professional expertise to do this, to revamp their math pathways, recognizing that college algebra class can be such an impediment for students and is often designed in ways that don't well align for the careers and for the degree paths that students are on. We are seeing some institutions engage in downsizing. Some of this is voluntary. In the case of St. Michael's, it was very deliberate, and that allowed them to do things with attrition. More often, I think we see institutions that believe, whether or not they have any data to support that belief, that they're going to grow, and then when they don't grow, they end up having to cut, and that can be very painful. I think as I suggest that we might be seeing more institutions going toward downsizing, it's also worth noting that we saw some fundamental change during the time of COVID that underscored the reality that campus governance is an important issue when we talk about downsizing. That if we're going to engage in this, we need to do it well, and that means engaging all stakeholders fully. Otherwise, things can go in a very counterproductive way. Now, all of the examples I've given you so far have been institutions working individually. I also see interesting efforts to work collaboratively. So just one example of that coming from Nebraska in Omaha. So here we have 3 institutions. The first is a 2-year institution. The second, the University of Nebraska Omaha, is the 4-year institution. And then the University of Nebraska Medical Center offers graduate programs. And what they recognized is that they were in essence pipelines one to the other. Many students were moving from MCC to UNO to UNMC. And they also recognized that in recent years, we've seen an uptick in mental health needs. And that presents a challenge. We have students who are moving from one institution to the next. And in addition to all of the difficulties that we can present them with our bureaucracies in terms of that transfer, students were at the same time experiencing a discontinuity in mental health care. They were moving from one caregiver and then having to find another. Well, when you think about what's involved there, a transfer from one institution to the next, one life stage to the next, perhaps, to time that so that the student also has to go through that while they're experiencing a discontinuity in mental health care does seem to be a bit foolish. And so what they've done is moved toward having a coordinated, shared mental health care provision. So students, as they move from one institution to the next, now can maintain the same relationship with their caregiver. So this is just one of many examples. We see the tribal colleges collaborating on data work. We see the Sea Change grants, offering grants for institutions that might move toward mergers or partnerships. There's a lot of talk right now about how we might leverage maybe the lessons learned in COVID and the technology that we are now familiar with, including this technology, to perhaps have joint degree offerings. Maybe you can have an Arabic studies program at a small private institution despite low enrollments by collaborating with some other small institutions. In my case at Carleton in Northfield, Minnesota, about 1.5 miles away is St. Olaf. And we've worked with St. Olaf on a number of these collaborations. But I think we're recognizing today that it doesn't have to be an institution 1.5 miles away. Maybe it's Davidson that Carleton should be seeking a collaboration with, and we can use this technology to break those barriers. So those are some of the observations I've got. I'm going to turn it over to Jeff, and then I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you very much. Jeff?
Thanks, Nathan. When I need to go for demographic information, I really think that Nathan is the go-to person on this, has done some great research on this, and I think has really been a great contribution to the field. I'm going to talk a little bit about the one piece of demographics, which of course demographics is often destiny for institutions. When you think about the 18 to 22-year-old student, obviously there's so much growth potential in adult students as an opportunity for colleges and universities. One of the things I've never understood in the 25 years I've been covering higher education is we have thousands of institutions after the slice of high school graduates, which, a couple million a year. And every year we have a growing number of adult students, many of whom started at community colleges, never finished a degree, and others who finished high school but didn't go right on to college. There's estimates all over the place, but we're talking tens and tens of millions of students, and yet we only have a small segment of the higher education number of institutions going after adult students. And if I'm just looking at this from a market perspective, that would be like Apple saying, we're only going to provide the Apple iPhone to 5% of the American population, and we're going to ignore 95% of it. And in many ways, I think that's what's happening right now in American higher education, is that the adult students in some ways are the siren song of institutional leaders. When I talk to trustees, when I talk to presidents who say, when they look at the demographic trends that Nathan just presented, they say, what are we going to do? And a lot of them say, we're going to try to recruit adult students. And then 5 minutes later, they'll start to talk about their strategic plan, which of course is all focused on the 18 to 22-year-old student. And one of the things that we're seeing, and this really goes to the heart of my book, Who Gets In and Why, Year Inside College Admissions, was really aimed at the consumer market in higher education, meaning students, parents, and counselors, is that we're seeing a real growing divide in American higher education when it comes to admissions. And we've really been seeing this probably over the last 50 years, but particularly over the last 20 years. Work that's been done by Caroline Hawksby has found that, for example, the number of selective colleges has actually gone down over the last 50, 60 years, as essentially what used to be a local and regional business has become a national and international business. So, for example, when it was much more difficult to travel from the East Coast to the West Coast, and we didn't have devices like this, and you can't really see my cell phone there, but when we didn't have devices like mobile phones, and we didn't have devices like Zoom, going to school in California, for example, from Pennsylvania, where I grew up, was a big deal. But starting in the even as late as the 70s and 80s, with the birth of better telecommunications, Southwest, and easier travel, people now started to say, going to Berkeley is not that big of a deal, or going out to California or Arizona or Washington State. And so what ended up happening, as Hawksby found, was that what used to be this local regional market, where students would essentially, talented students, highly talented students in terms of academics, would go to their local or regional institutions. Now they started applying everywhere. And the same thing was happening, by the way, not only in Boston and Washington, but it was happening in Minneapolis and Washington State and everywhere else. And so students kept applying, all these students all over the place, instead of applying necessarily to their local institution, now started to apply to the same set of national institutions. And then, by the way, we add the international students to that. And so what's happened over the last 50 years is that you had a separation between those national and international brands and kind of everybody else. And some institutions with well-planned marketing campaigns and strategic plans kind of jumped on that bandwagon. I dedicate a significant portion of one of the chapters to Northeastern University, for example, which in the late 1990s, according to U.S. News and World Report, was ranked 140. And Richard Freeland, who was the president at the time, Northeastern, for those of you who are familiar with Northeastern in Boston, at that time was known as commuter school. And Richard Freeland, who was the president, who had come from UMass Boston in 1995, recognized the same trends that Nathan is talking about here. And he realized that by the end of the millennials coming out of college, that the generation of students at 18 were going to go down, particularly in the Northeast, and that Northeastern wouldn't be able to survive as an institution if it didn't look beyond its borders. And so with a very, very deliberate strategic plan starting in the late 1990s, he felt that the only way to become a more selective institution was to improve its brand with potential students. And the way to do that was with something that started about 10 years earlier with an annual ranking that just came out last week, which was US News and World Report. So his feeling was we can't become Harvard, because Harvard was started before the founding of the country. There was all these institutions, William and Mary, Harvard, even the Berkeleys of the world, UNC, Michigan. There's all these institutions that have their market position because of their history. Well, there's a whole new set of institutions that couldn't do that. Institutions like NYU, George Washington University, University of Southern California, Northeastern, and a bunch of other institutions that over the last 30 or 40 years have decided that the only way to get into that club, because they couldn't get in through historical reasons, was to kind of change their brand perception in the marketplace. And one way to do that was to rise in the rankings. So how do you take a place like Northeastern at 150 and make it a top 50 university, which it is today? And so what they did at Northeastern was essentially reverse engineer the rankings. And they wanted to see what went into those rankings, and how can we start to pull those levers to start to move up in the rankings. And so, one of the things they discovered was that a lot of students wanted to go to school in Boston. Now, they didn't want to go to Northeastern. They wanted to go to BU or BC or, even Harvard or MIT. Well, their feeling was, well, if we could take some of those students and get them to come to Northeastern, especially those academically talented students, we could, again, move up in the rankings because we would get better students. And so what they started to do using Merit Aid was essentially buy high achieving students who wanted to come to Boston, wanted to go to a different university, but ended up coming to Northeastern because they were essentially giving many of those seats for free. And eventually the academic profile of students coming in into Northeastern changed dramatically, which really helped their rankings. But the big part of the rankings, as many of you know, is really the academic reputation survey that US News sends out to college presidents and admissions deans everywhere. And that is harder to change. And so what Richard Freeland decided to do was he brought in people from political campaigns, some of whom worked on Michael Dukakis's 1988 campaign. I'm not quite sure that's the campaign that you should be following necessarily, because you probably want to have a winning campaign, but brought in people from Michael Dukakis's campaign in 1988, and they approached this idea of moving up in the rankings like a political campaign. They knew they only had so many years to move up in those rankings. And so one of the things they did was and I was at the Chronicle when they did this, they started taking out these advertisements in the Chronicle of higher education that almost looked like newspaper stories that talked and touted what Northeastern was doing. And to people reading the Chronicle, they said, wow, I didn't know Northeastern was doing that. And by the way, kind of looked like a news story. He would send out, and now this is much more common, he would send out these very slick packages to college presidents everywhere and admissions deans who were right before they would vote in US News, telling them all the great things they were doing at Northeastern. And the other thing that he did is that whenever he traveled to another place, he would go to visit the president of that local university, they would look for places that were ranked higher than Northeastern. And they would go and visit them, and they would, and he would tell them all the great things that was happening at Northeastern. And then the president would say to him, "But you're ranked lower than us, and we're not doing those things." And so suddenly it would go through the minds of the president that maybe Northeastern is really better than it was. And so this has all happened and the same playbook was followed by a number of other universities. And so then starting in 2000, because of the birth of the internet, the rise of the Common App, what we started to see were students then applying to more colleges. So we had this rise in the number of these more selective universities. We had more highly talented students applying to more of these top colleges, and they started not to get in, right? Because what was happening was more students were applying to these colleges, but one thing that these selective colleges didn't do, because they're selective, is they didn't increase the size of their freshman class. And so suddenly now, acceptance rates that were in the 30s or 40s as late as the 1990s now suddenly started to tick down. And a great example of this is I got my start in higher education working on the US News and World Report rankings. And when I started writing my book, Who Gets In and Why, I pulled out the rankings from the year I interned, or actually the year I would have gone to college. So 1991, I graduated high school, and I looked at the rankings for that year. And that year, the acceptance rate at the University of Pennsylvania was 42%. Most of the Ivy League was in the 20% in terms of their acceptance rate. But what started happening in 2000, those numbers started to tick down as the number of students applying to college, applying to colleges, not individual students, but multiple applications started to go up. And most of these selective colleges kept the size of their freshman class the same. And so over the course of 20 years, what has happened is that the average student might be applying to 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 plus colleges. You know, in 2000, there were 4 million college applications filed. So, you know, and there was only about, I think, a little over maybe 2 million plus students who graduated from high school that year. 4 million college applications in total. Now we have over 10 million applications being filed on average. Again, and when the senior class is actually slightly even smaller, going into coming out of the pandemic and going into this demographic cliff that Nathan talked about. And so what's happening is that, and most of those applications, those multiple applications, are going to the same set of schools. So you have this growing divide now in admissions. The same institutions that Nathan is talking about that is at risk, and he has this great graphic in his book that talks about essentially market position, and really where the schools that are most worried about demographics are those schools that are less selective. They might take 50+% of the students who apply, though they're much more local and regional in terms of their student bodies. They are much more worried about where demographics are going now, while everybody else at the very top, and we're probably talking maybe 100 and 150, no more than 200 universities here who are in the selective category, are kind of have an abundance of riches in terms of, some more than others, in terms of their applications. And what this does is it really kind of sets up this interesting dichotomy in terms of how we talk about higher education in this country. Because on one hand, you have people reading Nathan's book, and I talk to trustees a lot, so I kind of hear them. They're reading Nathan's book and they're like, oh my God, the demographic cliff is coming. Let's prepare for it. And then on the other hand, you keep reading these articles in the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times about these ultra low acceptance rates to colleges and universities, which mostly, by the way, are the Ivies and the Ivy Plus and a small group of liberal arts colleges. And you get people thinking it's never been harder to get into college. And so often when I was reporting this book, I heard from parents and students saying, well, how, it's so difficult to get into college. I would never get into the university that I went to as an undergraduate. And I had to keep reminding them that the average acceptance rate of American college or university is 65%, and that there are thousands of colleges out there, some of whom never essentially shut down their admissions operation because they're constantly accepting students. And so I think that this is the tension that we are faced with right now when we think of higher education as a system and when we think of admissions as a system. Because for the vast majority of American colleges and universities, and to be honest with you, for a vast majority of Americans who have kids going to college, what is happening at the most selective colleges really has kind of nothing to do with what is in their daily lives. I'm on the board of a small private college in upstate New York, right? What is happening at these highly selective colleges in terms of how they're dealing with admissions, in terms of how they're dealing with their own story, really has nothing to do with the way we should be running our institution. But unfortunately, what's happening is I spoke to a board at a fairly select, actually a very selective college, university, research university, recently, and the board members kept bringing up topics around what's happening in their local community college and in their community, or was actually bringing up some stuff with demographics. And I'm thinking that has nothing to do with what you need to be worrying about right now. In the same way with the vast majority of parents out there whose kids are going to easily go through the admissions process, are going to find a great fit and end up at a great place. And unfortunately, and I will be honest with you, as somebody who started in higher education journalism, I will say the media is slightly at fault here, because I will tell you, last week when the U.S. News and World Report rankings came out, and Columbia was caught cheating on its numbers, what was the story in all the major press? What happened when CNN, which never calls me, called me and asked me to be on? That's what they wanted to talk about. And so you have this narrative that's set out there that I think, to be honest with you, is dangerous for how we need to be talking about a lot of the stuff that Nathan focused on. How do we build these student-centered universities and colleges for the vast majority of institutions, and not worry about this small select group of institutions, which, to be honest with you, they're going to be fine. They're going to be fine almost no matter what happens in the world. And I think that is our challenge that we face today. So with that, I'm going to turn it back and hopefully take some good questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jeff. And now I'm going to bring up some of the questions that listeners have brought up. One says, if affirmative action admissions policies at private universities are curtailed by the Supreme Court, what effects do you anticipate on those institutions, as well as on highly selective institutions like UC that are not permitted to use racial preferences? Could you comment, both of you, on that subject?
I'll just throw out one piece, and then I'm sure Nathan has some ideas too. We know that proxies for affirmative action have not always worked in other states, right? We obviously know in states where affirmative action was banned, as far back as the 1990s, the top percent plans, which were very popular back then, in the California and Texas and Florida and other places, have not quite exactly worked as projected, and in many cases take advantage of how we have a segregated K through 12 system. I do think that some of this will be muted, some of the impact, and I think we're all assuming, by the way, where this is going with the Supreme Court, that this current court will strike down the use of affirmative action in admissions, is that the rise of test optional and test blind, particularly in the UC system right now, I think will help institutions craft their class, and I think it will just become difficult for future litigants, because what they've used, obviously, in the Harvard case are SAT scores of Asian applicants in particular to kind of prove their case. Well, when not everyone is submitting test scores, it becomes much more difficult to prove that case that institutions are using race as a factor in admissions, because you don't have that standardized test now to compare to, and it's a lot harder to use tests grades in high school, because you're talking 25,000 different high schools, which all have different grading policies. So I think not that this will be easy for institutions, but I think that I will be surprised. Well, first of all, I will be surprised if the Supreme Court doesn't strike down affirmative action, and I will be surprised if highly selective colleges go back to requiring the test, with the exception of MIT, which has already done it. Go back to requiring the test, because I think it will tie their hands in terms of what they can do.
Yeah, I think I would add, just to underscore something that Jeff said earlier that's relevant here as well, is that again, we have many, many, many institutions for which this will make almost no difference whatsoever, because they're essentially open access. And so there's a tendency again to focus on, oh, so how is this going to play out in what might be, I don't know, 5% of higher education or something like that. And it's not an unimportant part of higher ed, but I think it goes back to Jeff's point of we get fixated for a number of reasons on what is really a minority experience. I think about Glenn Lowry, an economist, has written eloquently about the difference between being race blind and being race indifferent. And we sometimes talk about what's about to potentially happen as being an earth-shattering shift, but we forget that we're already in a situation where something like a third of high school graduates live in a state where this is the policy one way or another, whether it's the law or whether it's an executive order. So we have a lot of states that are grappling and I think adapting to the new incentives. If I can't use race explicitly, then I'll seek other ways. And while there have been obviously critiques of things like the 10% plan in Texas, I think again sometimes those critiques might miss the point that Jeff was making about the danger of fixating on the very top. So I know in my own discipline, I saw one analysis of the effects of college enrollment due to the 10% plan. And while there were substantial gains in college enrollment, there was sort of the paper's conclusion was in essence, the 10% plan was ultimately a failure because the African-American students weren't ending up at the flagship. And I don't know what to make of that. On one hand, I think prestige has something going for it. There's a network that you get when you go to the flagship institution, but recognizing the broader point that Jeff just made about, look, students are going to match typically well, and a good match is really, really important. I don't know that it's necessarily a failure, and I'd be curious if there had been some qualitative follow-up with some of the students who did not go to the flagship, African-American students in particular in Texas, to see whether they thought it was a failure. Or did they think, no, this was a very, very good choice for me. There are all sorts of good reasons why I didn't want to go to Texas at Austin. I understand the food scene is pretty nice at Texas and Austin, but there might be other factors that go into whether an African-American student feels like that's a good match for them. And so, I anticipate that if we do move away from explicit affirmative action, explicit race-based admissions, you're going to see a lot of adaptation, as Jeff suggests, because colleges are going to continue to want to do what they've been doing, and they've shown in the past a willingness and an ability, at least to a good degree, to adapt in their practice to accomplish those goals.
Thank you very much. I have another question. One has to do with some other options for institutions. There seems to be a good bit of interest in enlarging online learning. Some of that has to do with the cost of higher education. And then the other thing along with that relates to cost of higher education are these new options for post-secondary education that are not the baccalaureate. So looking at those two options that potentially might lower costs, how do you see those as promising real competitors as number of students, number of high school graduates decline? Do you see those as real competitors? Go ahead.
I guess I could start. I think on online education, I think largely until now, it has not brought down the cost of higher education, largely because, like everything else in higher education, it's cross subsidizes other things, right? So institutions with growing and large online entities are using it not to increase access. It's mission driven, but they're also using it to generate and I know this is a dirty word in higher education, they're using it to generate a profit, which subsidizes a lot of their undergraduate face-to-face and on the ground things. And so I think until, to be honest with you, until we fix the business model, the underlying business model of higher education in terms of how we charge for it, how we fund it, and who pays and how they pay, I'm not quite sure that online education, unless somebody comes in and totally disrupts it like an Amazon, I don't think necessarily that it will reduce costs. I'm actually more bullish on the on rethinking the baccalaureate. There's a great project going on with Bob Zemsky, a Penn, around a group of, I think, 20 plus institutions who are thinking about who are working on a 3-year degree. And, the 3-year degree has been tried a billion times, it seems, in higher ed without success because students want the 4-year experience. But that's because we largely have tried to rush the 4-year experience. We've tried to stuff the 4-year experience into 3 years rather than try to rethink the entire experience. So there's a really interesting experiment going on in Nathan's home state of Minnesota at the University of Minnesota at Rochester, which this fall launched a 2.5-year bachelor's degree in health sciences in conjunction with Google and the Mayo Clinic. I think it's going to be where there's hands-on learning. It rethinks the entire curriculum. So we're not trying to stuff 120 credits into 3 years. As Randy Bass at Georgetown always talks about, we have to think about how we credit co-curricular activities. That, to me, where we talk about bending the cost curve, I'm actually much more excited about kind of rethinking the undergraduate degree rather than online education. I think online education has a lot of other positives to it, largely around access, but I don't think it's necessarily going to bend the cost curve.
Okay, thank you.
I think I'd add on discussions of online education. Often I hear people talk in very 0-1 terms, as if somehow you either do this or you don't do it. When in the reality, I think students maybe are ahead of us in their thinking here. It's just another way to deliver. So at many institutions, we have students who are doing in person for one course while in the same semester taking an online course, and they don't think that's remarkable at all. I view the online tool as being so much more than somehow like, can we just offload the facilities or something like that? It's likely to be about more than that. And to Jeff's point, I agree. I don't, if you continue to think, well, I'm just going to do online what I've done in the past, we're going to get stuck with one person standing in front of a room of, I don't know, X students, whether X is 30 or 500, depending on your context. Okay, there's a modest facility savings there, but the real cost of higher ed is in the people. So you haven't really moved the needle at all just to move an in-person experience online. So I think it's not really about the online experience being online any more than, DVDs or VHS tapes, or for that matter, the book, fundamentally replace what higher ed does. It's going to take something more holistic if we're going to see some really radical change.
Thank you very much. I'm looking at the chat function. I see one question that says, in Nathan's slide about white students becoming the minority, he mentioned that as a challenge. What are the admissions strategic ramifications of this demographic shift, and what is challenging?
Yeah, so the challenge is just relative to higher ed's historic past. We have not recruited well in the African-American community, the Hispanic community. We have not made our campuses truly homes to these students. We talk about making our campuses more welcoming, which I don't think is necessarily wrong, but because I think there's some things that we've done to be unwelcoming, but I think it's a perspective that is far from complete. I don't hope that my non-Hispanic white students feel welcomed on campus. My aspiration is that they feel like they own the place, and that's my aspiration for all of my students. And so when I say it's challenging, it's just to acknowledge that higher education in the last 100 or 50 or 20 years has disproportionately drawn from some groups more effectively than others. And if the population is shifting away from that subgroup, your financial bottom line is at risk. So if it was always the right thing to do to seek access, now you have a financial imperative. If we do not figure out how to teach to all students, there will be financial consequences increasingly for American higher education. So there's, that's the challenge. How do I see the strategic ramifications? I think, to me, it comes back to that willingness to seriously look at so many things in our identities. When we have conversations on campus about all sorts of questions, but especially about this one, there are often a lot of things that are perceived as sacred cows or givens. And well, that's part of our mission. But if you pull up the mission statement, you say, where does it say that that's part of our mission, that is inviolable? We cannot change that. Most people can't point to evidence that it really is part of the mission. And if we are unwilling to adapt ourselves, even at the level of perhaps reconceiving what our self-identity as an institution is about, if we insist that students will meet us where we are at, rather than that we will take steps toward students who we in the past have not recruited, I think you're going to have a significantly more challenging time getting those students to think that your campus is a place where they will call home for the next 2 or 4 years, whatever the case may be. And so I think that's the challenge that we face, is a willingness to reconceive ourselves in new ways that are more flexible and more open, so that other people can enter into spaces that we cohabit and feel like it's their home as well.
Jeff?
Sorry, I was on mute. I don't have really anything to add from what Nathan had. I think that there's I guess the only thing I would say is that if you look at the recent research, both anecdotal and from polling, there's a real decline in trust and value of higher education right now, even among populations that were college, that would have long been considered college going. And I don't think we're at risk of suddenly now an entire generation not sending their kids to college, but I think there's an openness now to alternatives. Again, not that they wouldn't send their kids to any sort of post-high school experience, but there's an openness to alternatives. And I think that the alternatives will, if they create a sense of belonging, which is critical, by the way, to Generation Z, of all income levels, of all races, of all ethnicities, and a sense of purpose, I think those institutions, those entities, whether they're traditional institutions or alternatives, are going to be the winners over the next 10 years. Because students want to have a sense of belonging in their classroom, on their campus, in their whatever learning entity they're in. But more than that, if they're spending all this money to go to school, they want to have a purpose for being there. And if they're sitting in class and they're like, why am I here? I think, to be honest with you, in previous generations, we would have said, it's the cost of doing business, right? It's expensive, but we have to go somewhere between the ages of 18 to 22. Well, now it's much more expensive. And there's potential alternatives out there that include work and learning that I think people will just say, I'm leaving. And by the way, we saw that during the pandemic, right? We saw huge decreases in enrollment,
Yes.
We saw decreases in retention, and we saw decreases in transfer. Now, I don't think any of those are permanent, but I think that there is a permanent change in habits that have come because of the pandemic. And I think one of the habits, it was, we're going to go to this highly selective, we're going to go to this college after high school.
Thank you, both of you. I want to thank you. We do have a whole lot more questions, but I'm going to send them to you because we've come to the end of the hour. But I want to thank both of you so very much for this detailed and engaging webinar that you have created. Thank you very much. Thank you.